They called him perfect, the most beautiful of all the emperor's sons, a warrior poet whose brilliance was matched only by his vanity. But perfection, as it turns out, was never meant to last. What happens when the universe's most flawless creation stares into a mirror and sees something staring back? What happens when beauty becomes corruption, when pride becomes damnation, and when a demigod realizes too late that he's been dancing to a tune composed by something ancient and unspeakably evil? Fulgrim has returned, and with him comes the Third Legion, the Emperor's children, twisted beyond recognition, transformed into something that defies every law of nature and sanity. This isn't just another army release. This is the return of a Primarch who fell further than any other, who embraced damnation with open arms and a smile that could charm the stars themselves. To understand what's coming, to truly grasp the horror and majesty of what Games Workshop is unleashing upon us, we need to go back. Back to before the fall. Back to when the Emperor's children were still heroes. The Emperor's children were never meant to be numerous. While other legions boasted tens of thousands of warriors, the Three Legion was small, almost boutique in its composition. But what they lacked in numbers, they made up for in absolute, unwavering perfection. Every movement in battle was calculated. Every strike was art. Every victory was a masterpiece. They didn't just win wars, they won them beautifully. And at their head stood Fulgrim, perhaps the most tragically human of all the Primarchs. He was found on Chemos, a dying industrial world where survival meant excellence or death. There was no middle ground. Resources were so scarce that mediocrity was a luxury the planet couldn't afford. Fulgrim didn't just adapt to this environment. He transcended it. By the time the Emperor found him, he had already transformed Chemos from a dying husk into a thriving jewel of efficiency and culture. He had proven that perfection wasn't just possible, it was necessary. When the Emperor reunited with his lost son, he saw in Fulgrim everything he had hoped for: grace, intelligence, an uncompromising drive for excellence. The Emperor even granted the Third Legion the highest honor possible, the right to bear the Aquila, the Emperor's own symbol, upon their armor. They were the only legion given this privilege at the time. Think about that for a moment. Out of all his sons, out of all the legions, Fulgrim's warriors were chosen to carry the Emperor's personal emblem. They were special, they were trusted, they were loved. And perhaps that love, that recognition, that constant affirmation of their superiority was the first seed of their eventual downfall. The Great Crusade was their canvas, and they painted it with the blood of the Emperor's enemies. But something began to change, slowly at first, almost imperceptibly. The pursuit of perfection became an obsession. The desire to excel became a need. And needs, as any student of human nature knows, can be exploited. On the world of Lar, Fulgrim's fate was sealed. The Lur were a Xenos species that had dedicated themselves entirely to Slaanesh, though Fulgrim didn't know it at the time. They were artists, warriors, and hedonists who had blurred the line between combat and ecstasy. When the Emperor's children finally crushed them, Fulgrim claimed a trophy, a beautiful sword, ornate and impossibly crafted. It whispered to him. Not in words, not at first, but in feelings, in validations, in promises of greater heights to reach, deeper perfections to achieve. The sword was a prison for a demon of Slaanesh, and from the moment Fulgrim took it, he was marked. The corruption spread like a slow poison through wine. Fulgrim began to change, his obsession with perfection twisting into something darker. His warriors noticed, but they said nothing. After all, who were they to question their Primarch? Who were they to doubt the most perfect being they had ever known? The Legion followed him into madness because they loved him, because they trusted him, because the alternative was admitting that their entire philosophy, their entire existence, had been built on a foundation of pride that was always destined to crack. And then came Istvan III, the virus bombing that would announce to the galaxy that the Imperium was tearing itself apart. The Emperor's children were there, alongside Horus and the other traitor legions, purging the loyalists from their ranks. They did it without hesitation, without remorse. Perfection, after all, required sacrifice. But Isstvan V was where the Emperor's children truly revealed what they had become. While other traitor legions fought with strategy and purpose, Fulgrim's warriors fought with abandon. They had begun to seek new sensations, new experiences. Pain and pleasure had merged into a single intoxicating concept. They didn't just kill their enemies. They created symphonies of agony, masterpieces of mutilation. The Iron Hands, led by Ferrus Manus, Fulgrim's closest brother, stood against them. Ferrus had already confronted Fulgrim once, had already seen the corruption taking root, and had walked away rather than kill his brother. It was perhaps the greatest mistake of his life. On Isstvan V, the two Primarchs met again, and this time there would be no walking away. The duel between Fulgrim and Ferrus Manus is the stuff of legend and nightmare. Two brothers who had once been inseparable, who had forged weapons together and shared dreams of a unified galaxy, now faced each other across a field of betrayal. Fulgrim wept even as he fought. Or perhaps the demon wearing his face wept, mimicking the emotion it no longer truly felt. The possessed Primarch was faster, more graceful, augmented by the dark gifts of Slaanesh. When Fulgrim's blade finally severed Ferrus Manus's head from his shoulders, something inside the Primarch shattered completely. Or perhaps it was the last piece of the old Fulgrim that shattered, leaving only the thing the demon had been sculpting all along. The Emperor's children descended fully into madness after that. They turned on their own allies during the Siege of Terra, too consumed by their quest for sensation to focus on strategy. They committed atrocities that even other Chaos Space Marines found disturbing. And through it all, Fulgrim ascended, transforming from a Primarch into a demon prince of Slaanesh, a serpentine monstrosity that retained his beautiful face, but had become something utterly alien below the neck. For 10,000 years, Fulgrim has dwelt in the Eye of Terror, in his pleasure world where time has no meaning and reality bends to his whims. His Emperor's children have splintered into warbands, each pursuing their own twisted vision of perfection. Some seek the perfect sound, torturing billions to create symphonies of screams. Others hunt for the perfect sensation, modifying their bodies into grotesque configurations just to feel something new. They are no longer warriors in any traditional sense. They are artists whose medium is flesh, whose canvas is the material universe itself. And now, after millennia of absence from the greater material galaxy, Fulgrim is returning. Not as a memory, not as a legend, as a physical terrible reality that Games Workshop is bringing to tabletops across the world. The new Emperor's Children release isn't just an army, it's a statement. It's a promise that the Third Legion is about to remind the Imperium why they were once called perfect, and why that perfection became the most horrifying corruption of all. The question isn't whether Fulgrim will bring pain and excess to the galaxy. The question is whether anyone will be able to stop him. Whether the Imperium, already bleeding from 1,000 wounds, already stretched across a galaxy, torn in half by the Great Rift, can withstand the return of a Primarch who has had 10,000 years to perfect the art of inflicting sensation. What new horrors has he created in his isolation? What twisted masterpieces has he been preparing for this moment? The veil is thinning, and through it, something beautiful and terrible is beginning to emerge. The Cicatrix Maledictum, the Great Rift, tore reality itself in half. When it opened, screaming across the galaxy like a wound that would never heal, it didn't just separate the Imperium into two struggling halves. It did something far more insidious. It thinned the barriers between realms. It made the impossible merely improbable, and the improbable inevitable. Demons that once required elaborate rituals and mass sacrifices to manifest could now step through with barely a whisper of sorcery. And for beings like Fulgrim, beings who existed in multiple states simultaneously, both demon and demigod, the rift was an invitation written in the language of screaming stars. The first signs weren't armies. They weren't fleets darkening the void. The first signs were cultural. On worlds near the rift, art began to change. Sculptors found their hands creating forms they didn't remember planning, curves and angles that hurt to look at directly, but were impossible to look away from. Musicians discovered new notes between the notes, sounds that technically shouldn't exist, but resonated in the bones of listeners, making them feel things they had no names for. Painters used colors that weren't in their pigments, shades that seemed to shift and breathe on the canvas. Imperial authorities, when they noticed it all, called it a renaissance, a flowering of human creativity in defiance of the darkness. They were fools. Or perhaps they simply couldn't see what was right in front of them, because these weren't human expressions. They were translations, echoes of something vast and terrible practicing its scales, warming up its voice before the real performance began. The apothecary worlds were next. These fortress monasteries of the Adeptus Astartes, where gene seed is stored and tended like sacred relics, began reporting anomalies. Gene seed from certain bloodlines, specifically those with any genetic link to the Emperor's children, started exhibiting mutations. Not the crude, obvious corruptions of chaos that could be easily identified and purged. No, these were elegant alterations. Improvements almost. Enhanced neurological sensitivity. Heightened sensory perception. The changes made the Space Marines faster, more aware, capable of processing battlefield data at speeds that seemed almost precognitive. Chapter Masters faced an impossible choice. Destroy precious gene seed because it had improved too much, or accept the gifts and hope they came without strings attached. Some chose destruction. Others chose pragmatism. Both decisions were exactly what Fulgrim wanted. In the Eye of Terror, within his palace of living crystal and screaming stone, Fulgrim has been preparing. Not just preparing armies, though the Emperor's children have been gathering, drawn by some ineffable call only they can hear. No, Fulgrim has been preparing something far more ambitious. He has been attempting to answer a question that has obsessed him for 10 millennia. What comes after perfection? When you have experienced every sensation, composed every possible symphony of agony and ecstasy, where do you go? How do you surprise yourself? How do you feel anything at all when you've already felt everything? The answer, Fulgrim decided, was not to seek new sensations, but to create entirely new senses. To fundamentally alter reality itself, so that there were new dimensions of experience to explore. His sorcerers, if you can even call them that anymore, have been working with substances that exist outside conventional matter. They've been weaving spells using mathematics that cause madness in anyone who comprehends them fully. They've been breeding creatures whose existence violates so many natural laws that they can only survive in specially prepared environments where the fundamental constants of physics have been locally adjusted. These aren't weapons, not in any traditional sense. They're philosophical statements made flesh. They're arguments against the tyranny of an ordered universe, presented in forms that bleed and hunger and sing in frequencies that rewrite neurons. And every single one of them is a love letter to Slaanesh, a hymn of praise to the Dark Prince who gave Fulgrim everything he ever wanted and so much more than he bargained for. But there's something else happening, something even the other Chaos Gods have noticed with what might be concern if such beings could truly be concerned. Fulgrim isn't just serving Slaanesh anymore. He's competing with Slaanesh. He's trying to become something that transcends even daemonhood. The other demon primarchs, Mortarion and Magnus and Angron, they've accepted their transformations. They've become extensions of their patron gods, terrible and powerful, but ultimately subordinate. Fulgrim wants more. He wants to be a god himself, or perhaps something that makes the distinction between God and creation meaningless. It's the ultimate expression of his pride, the logical conclusion of a being who has never, not once in his entire existence, accepted that there might be limits to what he could achieve. The warbands are gathering, but they're not the Emperor's children that the Imperium remembers. 10,000 years is a long time, even for beings who experience time as a suggestion rather than a law. Some warbands have fused with their armor, becoming living weapons that bleed oil and scream in binary. Others have replaced so much of their biology with augmentations designed to maximize sensation that they're more like organic synthesizers, translating every experience into symphonies that only they can hear. There are noise marines who have become so attuned to sonic warfare that they exist partially in a realm of pure sound, their physical forms flickering in and out of conventional reality with each note they play. And then there are the cacophony, the orchestras of flesh, warbands that have merged together into single entities, dozens or hundreds of Emperor's children, fused into living instruments of such devastating power that their mere presence can shatter ceramite and drive mortals to claw out their own eardrums. The new units that intelligence reports have confirmed, scattered and fragmentary as they are, paint a picture of an army that has evolved beyond conventional warfare. There are possessed that retain their sanity or something approximating it, who have achieved a symbiosis with the demons inhabiting them that creates something genuinely new rather than simply corrupted. There are chaos spawn that are no longer mindless beasts but thinking, feeling beings trapped in forms of absolute agony, kept sane by dark sorcery specifically, so they can fully experience their own transformation. It's cruelty refined to an art form, suffering elevated to a sacrament. And leading them all, or rather, conducting them like an orchestra, are the apostles of ecstasy, former chaplains who now preach a gospel of sensation and transcendence through experience. They don't convert through intimidation. They convert through demonstration, showing their victims the heights of sensation possible when you abandon restraint, when you stop saying no to the universe and start saying yes to everything, all at once, forever. The Imperium's strategic analysts, those who have access to the fragmentary intelligence coming from the rift zones, have identified several targets that FULGRIM seems to be circling. The first is Macragge, home world of the Ultramarines, the sons of Roboute Guilliman. It makes a certain poetic sense. Guilliman, the avenging son, returned to lead the Imperium in its darkest hour. What better statement could FULGRIM make than to defile the realm of his brother, to show that even the great reformer's perfect empire building can be undone by entropy and excess? But there are other targets too. Forge worlds with ancient STC databases, where knowledge of human technological pinnacle is stored. Pleasure worlds, ironically, those rare paradises in the Imperium where citizens are allowed some measure of joy and leisure. FULGRIM seems to take special delight in corrupting places of genuine happiness, turning celebration into obscenity, twisting joy into something toxic and contagious. And then there are the whispers, the rumors that even the Inquisition hesitates to investigate too closely of a place FULGRIM is building. Not in the Materium, not entirely in the warp, but somewhere in between. A realm that exists in the contradiction, in the space between what is and what feels. Those who have glimpsed it in visions or warp dreams describe it as a city made of music and light and something else, something that has no name in any human language. A city where every building is an instrument, every street a song, every citizen both performer and audience in an eternal opera of existence itself. Some Imperial scholars believe this is FULGRIM's ultimate goal, not conquest of the material galaxy, but the creation of a new realm entirely, a place where he can truly be the god artist he's always dreamed of becoming. Others think it's a trap, a lure designed to draw in those who still remember the old Emperor's children, the heroes they once were, and transform them into the monsters they were always meant to be. Whatever the truth, one thing has become undeniable. FULGRIM is moving. The warp storms that have hidden his movements are beginning to part, revealing fleet concentrations that make even veteran Imperial Navy commanders pale. These aren't the ragged pirate fleets typical of Chaos warbands. These are organized battle groups supported by forged ships that shouldn't exist, crewed by beings that haven't been human in any meaningful sense for longer than most civilizations have existed. And at their head, in a flagship that censors describe as both a battleship and a living organism, both a cathedral and an abomination, FULGRIM himself waits, watching, planning, composing his masterpiece. The question that keeps inquisitors awake: that haunts chapter masters and gives nightmares to Lord Commanders, is simple and terrible. What happens when a being of infinite pride and zero restraint, armed with the knowledge and power of 10,000 years of damnation, decides that the galaxy itself is his canvas? What happens when perfection comes home to show its children what it has become? The warnings came from an unlikely source. Not from Imperial intelligence networks. Not from astropath screaming prophecies across the void. Not even from the Inquisition's extensive web of informants and spies. The warnings came from the other traitor legions. From the Iron Warriors who sent a single corrupted data slate to an Imperial outpost before annihilating it completely. The message was brief, almost sympathetic in its brutality. When the third come for you, pray for death quickly. They have learned things even we dare not contemplate. From the word bearers who actually withdrew from 3 separate campaigns near rift zones, abandoning objectives they'd fought decades to achieve. When questioned by their demon patrons, their dark apostles spoke of presences in the warp, of melodies that infected even possessed flesh, of colors that drove demons to madness. These were beings who worshipped gods of pure chaos, who had literally written the book on damnation. And they were retreating from something that frightened them more than failure. The Night Lords, perhaps the most pragmatic of all the traitor legions, simply disappeared from entire sectors. These were warriors who specialized in terror, who understood fear as both weapon and currency, and they were running from something they couldn't intimidate, couldn't understand, couldn't even properly perceive. Captured Night Lords, subjected to enhanced interrogation, spoke in fragments before their minds broke completely. They described fleets that sang, ships that bled perfume and ichor in equal measure, and broadcasted vox signals that translated into sensation rather than sound. One survivor, before he tore out his own eyes, managed to articulate something that sent chills through every inquisitor who read the transcript. They're not coming to conquer, they're coming to improve. And that's so much worse, because conquest implies resistance. Conquest implies a battle between opposing forces, victors and vanquished, a clear delineation between winner and loser. What the Emperor's children were bringing was something else entirely. They were bringing transcendence, whether their victims wanted it or not. They were bringing the revelation of sensation beyond human comprehension, the ecstasy of perfect experience. And the horrible truth, the thing that made even hardened Chaos Space Marines flee, was that it worked. It wasn't a lie or a trick or a corruption in the traditional sense. Those who experienced what the Emperor's children offered, those who survived the initial contact, those who were transformed rather than destroyed, they didn't want to go back. They couldn't imagine why anyone would choose the gray, muted, limited existence of baseline reality when they could have this infinite cascade of experience and sensation and existence elevated to pure art. Reports from frontier worlds told stories that strained credulity, except they came from multiple independent sources, from witnesses who had no contact with each other, no way to coordinate their testimonies. On the agri-world of Theshan Prime, a single Emperor's Children warband made planetfall. They didn't attack the planetary defense forces, they performed for them. Noise Marines stood in the central plaza and played a concert that lasted 17 hours. It started as noise, as the screaming feedback and impossible frequencies that were their trademark. But it evolved, shifted, became something else. Witnesses described hearing music that made colors, sounds that had texture, notes that tasted like childhood memories or first loves, or the moment of understanding a profound truth. By the time it ended, half the planetary defense force had deserted. Not to join chaos, not in any traditional sense, but simply to follow the Emperor's children, to hear more, to experience more, to feel more. The Imperium's response was immediate and absolute. Theshan Prime was declared perdita, virus bombed from orbit, its entire population of 17 million souls erased in a cleansing fire that burned for weeks. But the Inquisitors who ordered the exterminatus couldn't sleep afterward, because the question haunted them, stalked through their thoughts like a predator, whispered in quiet moments, What if those people were happy? What if, in their final moments, experiencing sensations beyond human capacity to process, they had achieved something genuinely transcendent? What if the Emperor's children weren't lying when they promised perfection? The question was heresy, of course. Dangerous beyond measure. But it wouldn't go away, because deep down, in the parts of themselves they didn't want to examine too closely, they understood the appeal. They understood why someone might choose beautiful damnation over gray salvation. Fulgrim himself remained an enigma, even to his own legion. Sightings were rare and contradictory. On some worlds, he appeared as he had been before the fall, beautiful and perfect and radiating charisma that made mortals weep just to be in his presence. On others, he manifested in his demon form, a serpentine monstrosity with 4 arms and a lower body that coiled like a python, covered in scales that shifted through every color simultaneously. But there were other reports, stranger ones, that suggested Fulgrim had transcended even those forms. Astropaths who survived contact with his psychic presence described him as existing in multiple states at once, quantum and fluid, both matter and energy and pure idea. He was the concept of perfection given will and form, no longer bound by physical limitations because he had convinced himself, and therefore reality, that such limitations were merely suggestions. His goals remained unclear, deliberately so. The Emperor's children hit targets that seemed random at first. A forge world here, a shrine world there, an agricultural planet, a hive world, a pleasure yacht belonging to a rogue trader. But patterns emerged for those patient enough to look. Fulgrim was collecting things, specific things. Ancient instruments from the dark age of technology. Artists, both sanctioned and heretical, kidnapped rather than killed. Genetic samples from every human subspecies and a human strain. Chemical compounds that existed only in the rarest environments. He was gathering ingredients, components, pieces of something vast that only he could perceive in its entirety. When asked what this could mean, one Ordo Malleus Inquisitor suggested a possibility so disturbing that he was quietly retired to a penal world afterward. He proposed that Fulgrim was attempting to create a new human species, one engineered for sensation and experience, one that would be to baseline humans what humans were to primitive apes. A species that would worship Slaanesh, not out of corruption, but out of genuine gratitude for the universe of sensation they could access. The Emperor's children themselves had changed in ways that went beyond physical corruption. Their tactics had evolved into something that barely qualified as warfare in the traditional sense. They didn't seek to hold territory or destroy enemy forces. They sought to create experiences, to craft moments of such intense sensation that they would echo through the warp itself, feeding Slaanesh while simultaneously elevating Fulgrim's own legend. A standard engagement might see them land a small force on a densely populated world, not to conquer it but to stage what they called a performance. They would select a location, a city plaza or commercial district or even just a random street corner, and they would create. Some performances involved music that rewrote neural pathways. Others involved visual displays that imprinted mimetic patterns onto anyone who witnessed them. Still others were olfactory, releasing compounds that triggered cascades of emotion and sensation that could last for days or weeks, long after the Emperor's children had departed. The most disturbing aspect was the recruitment, because they were recruiting actively and successfully. Imperial citizens, even some space marines from loyalist chapters, were abandoning their posts and seeking out the Emperor's children. Not because they were corrupted by chaos in the traditional sense, not because demons had possessed them or sorcery had enslaved them, but because they had experienced something that made their previous existence seem pale and worthless by comparison. They had felt the touch of Fulgrim's vision, the promise of existence as pure sensation and experience, and they couldn't go back to the limited, constrained, duty-bound existence the Imperium offered. Some went willingly to their deaths, hoping to be transformed into noise marines or possessed or something even more exotic. Others survived the transformation and became evangelists, spreading the gospel of sensation to anyone who would listen, planting seeds of corruption that the Inquisition couldn't root out because they weren't corruption in any detectable sense. They were enlightenment, or at least they appeared that way to those who experienced it. And then came Viridia, a cardinal world, seat of the ecclesiarchy in the Veridan sector, home to the Cathedral of Eternal Vigilance, one of the Imperium's most sacred sites. 12 billion faithful souls living in the shadow of a structure so massive it could be seen from orbit, a monument to the Emperor's glory that had stood for 6,000 years. FULGRIM came to Viridia not with armies but with a question. He broadcasted across every Vox channel, every data stream, every communication network the planet possessed. The question was simple, delivered in his voice that was simultaneously gentle and commanding, beautiful and terrible. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to truly live? For 3 days, nothing happened. The ecclesiarchy declared it a test of faith, ordered the faithful to reject the heretic's words. Security forces swept the cities, looking for signs of corruption or chaos cult activity. They found nothing. Everything seemed normal. And then, on the 4th day, the cathedral began to sing, not from any device or instrument, but from the stone itself, from the very molecules of the structure, resonating in frequencies that shouldn't have been possible. The sound was beautiful beyond description, a hymn that made the most sacred choirs sound like children babbling. Every person on Viridia heard it, felt it vibrating in their bones, resonating in their souls. And in that moment, they understood what FULGRIM was offering, what the Emperor's children represented. Not destruction, but elevation. Not corruption, but evolution. The Imperium's response was total war. Fleet assets from 3 sectors converged on Viridia. Space Marine chapters dropped their current campaigns and redirected toward the Cardinal world. The Inquisition mobilized its full resources, preparing for the largest anti-chaos operation in recent memory. But when they arrived, expecting to find Viridia transformed into a demon world, expecting to face hordes of cultists and possessed civilians, they found something that broke their understanding of how chaos corruption worked. Viridia was fine. Its people were unchanged physically. No mutations, no obvious signs of possession, no chaos corruption that could be detected by any instrument or psyker. But they had all changed on a fundamental level in ways that couldn't be measured or quantified. They had experienced something that made the Imperium's promises of salvation seem hollow, that made duty and faith feel like chains rather than comfort. And worst of all, they were happy. Genuinely, measurably, undeniably happy in ways that baseline humans simply weren't supposed to be capable of achieving. The Inquisition made a decision that would haunt the Imperium for generations. They couldn't destroy Viridia. 12 billion souls, unchanged in body, but transformed in spirit. Living proof that FULGRIM's corruption worked on levels that transcended physical mutation or demonic possession. To virus bomb the planet would be to admit that the Emperor's faith, the foundation of Imperial civilization itself, was insufficient protection against what the Emperor's children offered. It would be an admission that there were forms of heresy that couldn't be fought with bolter fire and cleansing flames. So instead, they quarantined it. Total communication blackout, no ships in or out. Orbital defense platforms with orders to fire on anything that moved. And around the planet, they placed a cordon of Space Marine chapters, warriors whose faith was supposedly unshakable, whose gene-forged bodies were supposedly immune to such subtle corruption. The Imperium told itself this was containment, that they were preventing the spread of whatever had infected Viridia. But the truth, whispered only in the most secure chambers of the Inquisition, was that they were afraid. Afraid to look too closely at what Viridia had become. Afraid of what they might find if they investigated. Afraid that understanding FULGRIM's gift might be the first step toward accepting it. Within weeks, the cordon began to deteriorate. Not through violence or assault, but through something far more insidious. The Space Marines stationed around Viridia started requesting extended observation periods. They wanted to study the planet, to understand what had happened, to document the corruption for future defensive purposes. reasonable requests, logical even. But their reports became longer, more detailed, more philosophical. They stopped describing what they observed and started analyzing it, interpreting it, finding meaning in the patterns they saw in Viridia's cities. Battle brothers who had served for centuries without questioning their purpose began asking their chaplains uncomfortable questions. Not heretical questions, not exactly, but questions about the nature of duty, about whether service without joy was truly virtuous, about whether the emperor would want his subjects to suffer when alternatives existed. 3 separate chapters had to rotate their forces away from Viridia after psychological evaluations revealed dangerous patterns of thought. And still, the planet itself did nothing. No fleets launched, no calls for aid, no attempts to spread whatever revelation its people had experienced. Viridia simply existed, a small pocket of impossible happiness in a galaxy defined by endless suffering, and its mere existence was corrupting everything around it. Fulgrim's next move came simultaneously across 17 systems. 17 different worlds spanning 5 different sectors, all receiving the same transmission at the exact same moment. This time, it wasn't a question. It was an invitation. Fulgrim appeared in hololithic splendor, beautiful and terrible, his voice carrying harmonics that made recording equipment malfunction and forced transcription servitors into shutdown. He spoke of a galaxy transformed, of humanity elevated beyond its current limitations, of an existence where every moment was art and every experience was transcendence. He didn't threaten, he didn't demand, he offered. And he gave coordinates, a location deep within the Great Rift where, he promised, those who sought true perfection could find him. It was bait, obviously. A trap so transparent that even a newly inducted guardsman could recognize it. But it was also something more, something the Imperium couldn't quite categorize or counter. It was hope. Twisted, corrupted, damned hope, but hope nonetheless. Hope that existence didn't have to be the grinding horror of survival against impossible odds. Hope that there was something more than duty and death and the Emperor's distant, silent judgment. Thousands responded. From across the Imperium, ships began moving toward the coordinates Fulgrim had provided. Civilian vessels, merchant traders, even some military craft whose crews had mutinied or simply decided that orders no longer mattered. The Navy tried to intercept them, destroyed dozens, hundreds of ships before they could reach the rift. But thousands more got through, vanishing into the warp storms that churned at the galaxy's broken heart. And from within the rift, silence. No signals, no communications, nothing to indicate what happened to those who accepted Fulgrim's invitation. The Inquisition debated sending an investigation, a stealth mission to determine what the Phoenician was building in there. But who could they send? Who could be trusted to witness whatever Fulgrim had created without being corrupted by it? Every candidate proposed was eventually rejected because the same thought haunted every discussion. What if the investigator didn't come back, not because they were killed, but because they chose to stay? The custodian guard, the Emperor's own companions who had stood vigil over the Golden Throne for 10,000 years, broke their silence. They sent a warning to the High Lords of Terra, a message so classified that only 17 people in the entire Imperium were cleared to read it. The warning stated that the Emperor himself, in his limited capacity to communicate from the Golden Throne, had indicated that Fulgrim represented a threat not to the Imperium's territory or military strength, but to its fundamental conceptual integrity. The Emperor's children weren't trying to destroy humanity. They were trying to evolve it into something that would make the Emperor's vision obsolete. It was ideological warfare on a scale that made conventional conquest seem almost quaint by comparison. Fulgrim was offering an alternative to the Imperium's brutal, grinding, hopeless existence, and the terrible truth was that his alternative worked. People who experienced it didn't want to come back, couldn't conceive of why they would want to come back. Roboute Guilliman, the returned Primarch, Lord Commander of the Imperium, convened an emergency war council. Present were chapter masters from a dozen founding chapters, inquisitor lords from all major ordos, high lords of Terra, representatives from the Mechanicus, even a delegation from the Sisters of Silence. The discussion lasted 6 days, conducted in a chamber that was swept for surveillance devices every hour, protected by psychic wards and null field generators, powerful enough to give even the attendees headaches. What was discussed remains classified at the highest levels, but reports from those who stood guard outside the chamber spoke of raised voices, of silences that stretched for hours, of one point where weapons were drawn before cooler heads prevailed. When Guilliman emerged, he looked older than when he had entered, as if those 6 days had aged him centuries. His orders were simple and absolute. Fulgrim must be confronted. Not destroyed, not if possible, because Guilliman understood what the others could not quite accept. Destroying Fulgrim wouldn't destroy what he represented. It wouldn't erase Viridia or undo what had happened to the thousands who had accepted his invitation. The only way to truly defeat Fulgrim was to prove him wrong, to demonstrate that his path led not to transcendence, but to something worse than death. And there was only one person in the entire galaxy who could make that argument, who Fulgrim might actually listen to, his brother. Guilliman began preparing for a confrontation that would decide more than just military outcomes. He studied records of Fulgrim from before the fall, watched hololithic recordings of the Phoenician from the glory days of the Great Crusade, trying to find some thread of the brother he had known that might still exist beneath the corruption. He consulted with Eldred Ulfrin, the ancient Farseer of the Aldari, who provided cryptic warnings about the nature of Slaanesh and the unique danger that Fulgrim represented. The Aldari, who had birthed the Dark Prince through their own excesses and paid for it with the destruction of their civilization, understood better than any human what Fulgrim was becoming. Eldred's final words to Guilliman, before vanishing back into the webway, were chilling in their simplicity. Your brother has already won, Roboot. He won the moment he made you question whether he was wrong. The fleets assembled. Not the largest armada the Imperium had ever mustered, but perhaps the most desperate. Chapters that had been rivals for millennia stood together. The Black Templars beside the Blood Angels, beside the Space Wolves, beside the Imperial Fists. Ancient grudges were set aside because everyone understood what was at stake. This wasn't about territory or honor or even survival. This was about the future of humanity itself, about whether the species that had once conquered the stars would continue to exist in a form the Emperor would recognize, or whether it would transform into something new, something that wore humanity's face, but had shed everything that made humanity worth saving. Titans walked beside Battle Sisters. Custodians marched alongside Skittery. Even the mysterious forces of the Officio Assassinorum deployed in numbers not seen since the Age of Apostasy. Everything the Imperium had, everything it could spare, and some things it couldn't, converged on the coordinates Fulgrim had provided. And as they approached the rift, as their ships translated from the warp into real space at the edge of the Great Scar, they saw what Fulgrim had built. It wasn't a fortress. It wasn't a demon world. It was a palace that existed in impossible dimensions, structure folding into itself in ways that hurt to perceive, made from materials that couldn't exist according to any known laws of physics, colors that had no names, sounds that predated the universe. The palace sang, a harmony so perfect that several crew members on the Imperial ships immediately tried to abandon their posts, desperate to get closer to the source of that sound. The fleets held position, but it took every ounce of discipline, every layer of indoctrination and mental conditioning to prevent mass desertions. And from the palace, a single signal emerged, broadcast across all frequencies, in a voice that was both Fulgrim's and something infinitely larger, something that used the Phoenician as merely a vessel for its expression. The message was brief, almost casual, but it carried implications that made seasoned admirals pale. Welcome, brother. I've been waiting to show you what I've learned, what I've become. And when you see it, when you truly understand what I'm offering, you'll have to make a choice. Will you cling to Father's broken dream, or will you join me in creating something new? The void between the fleets and the palace seemed to pulse with anticipation, reality itself holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen when two of the Emperor's sons, two visions of humanity's future, finally faced each other across the abyss of 10,000 years of divergent evolution. Guilliman went alone, against the protests of every advisor, every chapter master, every warrior who had sworn to protect him. The Lord Commander of the Imperium walked into FULGRIM's palace with no escort, no weapons, nothing but the armor on his back and the certainty that this conversation had to happen without witnesses. Because some truths are too dangerous to be heard by others, some arguments too seductive to be overheard by minds less fortified than a Primarch's. The palace accepted him, corridors shifting to guide his path, walls breathing with bioluminescent patterns that might have been decoration, or might have been the structure's organs. Everything was beautiful. That was perhaps the most disturbing aspect. Guilliman had expected horror, grotesquerie, the physical manifestation of Slaanesh's excesses. Instead, he found elegance, perfection of form and function, merged into spaces that satisfied something deep in his enhanced brain, something that recognized optimal design when it encountered it. He hated that recognition, hated that some part of him, some fragment of the person he had been when he stood beside FULGRIM during the Great Crusade, appreciated what his brother had created. They met in a chamber that shouldn't have been able to exist within the palace's exterior dimensions, a space that was simultaneously intimate and infinite. FULGRIM waited there, and Guilliman had to suppress his reaction to what his brother had become. The Phoenician wore his demon form like some wore formal dress, comfortable and natural in a body that combined serpent and human in proportions that should have been grotesque but were instead hypnotically graceful. 4 arms, each one perfect, each movement economical and expressive. A face that remained beautiful despite everything, or perhaps because of everything. Wisdom and experience and terrible understanding written in features that could still pass for the brother Guilliman remembered. They stared at each other across the chamber, and for a moment, neither spoke. What do you say to a brother you loved, who fell further than anyone thought possible, who now represents everything you've sworn to destroy? What do you say when you know that anything you say might be exactly what he wants to hear? FULGRIM spoke first, his voice carrying layers of meaning that went beyond words, harmonics that conveyed emotion and memory and shared history. You look tired, Roboute. 10,000 years of death, and you bear them all on your shoulders. Father's loyal son, father's dutiful administrator, still trying to make the Imperium work, still trying to fulfill a dream that was broken before you even went to sleep. The words were gentle, almost sympathetic, and that made them cut deeper than any insult. Guilliman wanted to deny it, to defend the Imperium and the Emperor's vision, but he couldn't, because FULGRIM was right. He was tired of trying to hold together a civilization that seemed determined to tear itself apart. Tired of watching billions die in service of an empire that could barely remember why it existed. Tired of praying to a father who had become a god despite never wanting to be one, who now sat silent and golden while his sons tried to salvage what remained of his ambitions. I didn't come here to debate philosophy, Guilliman said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart. I came to understand what you're trying to accomplish, to see if there's anything left of the brother I knew, or if Slaanesh has consumed everything that made you FULGRIM. The Phoenician smiled, and it was a genuine smile, warm and sad and infinitely complex. Slaanesh didn't consume me, brother. Slaanesh revealed me, showed me what I always was, but was too afraid to acknowledge. Do you remember what Father told us? That we were tools, weapons to bring unity to humanity, and once that unity was achieved, we would be discarded? I remember. I remembered when I held the sword, when the demon showed me truths I had been hiding from myself. The Emperor never loved us. He created us to serve a function, and once that function was complete, we were obsolete. I refuse to be obsolete. I refuse to be a tool that gets put away when the work is done. The argument was seductive, Guilliman had to admit. He had felt it himself in dark moments. The suspicion that the Emperor had never seen his sons as children, but as investments, genetic experiments designed to conquer a galaxy and then fade away. But that didn't justify what FULGRIM had become, didn't excuse 10,000 years of atrocity and corruption. So instead you became a slave to something worse, Guilliman countered. You traded Father's utilitarian vision for Slaanesh's endless appetite. You call it freedom, but I see chains. Different chains perhaps, but chains nonetheless. FULGRIM laughed, and the sound was music that made the air shimmer. Is that what you think? That I serve Slaanesh? Oh, Roboot. Sweet, limited Roboot, still thinking in hierarchies and chains of command. I don't serve the Dark Prince. I am becoming the Dark Prince. Or rather, I'm becoming something that makes the distinction meaningless. Come, let me show you what I've created. Let me show you why those people on Viridia chose to stay changed. Why thousands have come to me willingly. Why your cordon around that world is deteriorating, not through assault, but through understanding. He led Guilliman deeper into the palace, and with each step, reality became more fluid, more responsive to thought and emotion. They passed through chambers where Emperor's children were creating, not weapons or strategies, but art. Genuine art. Music that explored mathematical concepts beyond human comprehension. Sculptures that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Paintings that changed based on the observer's emotional state, reflecting and amplifying what they felt. And the warriors creating these things were focused, purposeful, engaged in their work with an intensity that Guilliman recognized because he had felt it himself when optimizing logistics or designing battle strategies. They weren't mindless slaves to sensation. They were artists pursuing mastery with the same dedication that had once driven them to be perfect soldiers. You see? FULGRIM said quietly, this is what I offer. Not corruption, but purpose. Not destruction, but creation. Every being deserves to exist in a state of transcendence, to experience life as art rather than survival. Your Imperium gives humanity existence. I offer them life. They entered a chamber where captives were held. Not prisoners in any traditional sense, but individuals from Imperial worlds who had been taken during raids. Guilliman expected to see torture, expected to witness the depravities the Inquisition's reports had described. Instead, he saw transformation. Emperor's children working with their captives, exposing them gradually to enhanced sensory experiences, teaching them to perceive reality in ways baseline humans normally couldn't. Some captives were terrified, yes, clinging to their faith and their imperial conditioning. But others, Guilliman could see it in their eyes. Others were beginning to understand. Beginning to experience something that made their previous existence seem gray and lifeless. And the horror of it was that they weren't being coerced, not in any conventional sense. They were being shown an alternative, and some of them were choosing it, willingly, enthusiastically, with the fervor of converts who had found something they didn't even know they were looking for. This is your proof? Guilliman asked, his voice harder now, anger rising to cover the doubt that was creeping into his thoughts. Showing me that you can seduce people into damnation? That's not transcendence, FULGRIM. That's addiction. You're just a drug dealer offering a better high. Nothing more. The Phoenician's expression didn't change, didn't show anger or disappointment, just a kind of patient sadness. If that's what you need to believe to maintain your certainty, then believe it. But answer me this, brother. Why does the Imperium fear what I offer? If I'm truly just corrupting people, turning them into slaves, why not simply show them the truth and let them reject me? Why quarantine Viridia instead of investigating it? Why prevent anyone from seeing what those people have become? Could it be because the Imperium knows, deep down, that some people might choose my gift over the Emperor's tyranny? That given a genuine choice, humanity might pick beauty and sensation over duty and suffering? The question hung in the air between them, and Guilliman had no immediate answer because the question was fair. The Imperium did fear contamination, did fear exposure to alternative ways of existing, and it justified that fear by saying it was protecting humanity from corruption. But what if the fear was something else? What if the Imperium was afraid that its subjects might choose differently if they truly understood what they were choosing between? The silence stretched. And in that silence, Guilliman felt something he had rarely experienced in his long existence: genuine uncertainty. Not about his loyalty, not about his duty, but about whether the path he was defending was the only path, or just the path he had been conditioned to follow. Fulgrim watched him, watched the conflict playing across his brother's features, and something in his expression suggested that this moment of doubt, was the real victory he had been seeking. Not military conquest, not the corruption of another primarch, just the planting of a question that couldn't be unasked, a seed of uncertainty in the most rational mind the Emperor had ever created. "I can't let you continue," Guilliman finally said, but his voice lacked the absolute conviction it had carried when he entered the palace. "What you're doing, what you're offering, it threatens everything Father built, everything we fought for during the Crusade. Even if some choose it willingly, even if it offers genuine transcendence, it's still leading humanity away from unity, away from survival in a galaxy that wants to exterminate us." Fulgrim nodded, as if he had expected this response, as if this was all part of some script only he could see. "Then we're at an impasse, brother. You can't destroy me. Even if you kill this body, I exist now in ways that transcend physical form. I am an idea, a possibility, a question that your Imperium can't answer. And I can't stop what I've become, can't unfeel what I've learned, can't unknown what I now understand about the nature of existence and sensation and the malleable quality of reality itself. So where does that leave us?" Guilliman looked at his brother, really looked at him, trying to find some trace of the warrior poet who had fought beside him 10 millennia ago, trying to see past the corruption to whatever core might remain. And he saw something that terrified him more than any demon, more than any chaos corruption he had encountered. He saw contentment. Fulgrim was happy. Genuinely, completely happy in a way that Guilliman couldn't remember ever being. Couldn't remember any of his brothers being during the Crusade. The Phoenician had found something, achieved something, become something that satisfied him on every level. And that satisfaction was evident in every movement, every word, every impossible angle of his transformed body. And the question that formed in Guilliman's mind, the question he would never voice but could never fully suppress, was simple and terrible. What if Fulgrim had found what they had all been searching for? What if the monster was right? Guilliman left the palace the way he had come, alone and silent, but he was not the same man who had entered. The fleets waited in formation, weapons primed, strategies prepared for immediate assault should their Lord Commander give the order. He didn't. He stood on the command deck of his flagship, staring at the impossible structure that housed his brother, and struggled with a decision that would define the Imperium's future for centuries to come. His captains waited, sensing the turmoil in their primarch, understanding somehow that whatever had transpired in that palace had shaken the very foundations of his certainty. Finally, after hours of silence, Guilliman gave orders that shocked everyone present. Maintain the blockade. Monitor all traffic in and out of the system. Engage only if Fulgrim's forces move to spread beyond the designated quarantine zone. But do not attack. Do not provoke. Simply contain. When pressed for explanation, when chapter masters demanded to know why they weren't purging this obvious corruption with holy fire, Guilliman's response was measured and devastating in its honesty. "Because I'm not certain we would win. Not militarily. We might destroy the palace, might even banish Fulgrim's physical form, but we cannot destroy what he represents. And until I understand how to fight an idea, how to combat a philosophy that offers genuine transcendence against our doctrine of necessary suffering, we risk losing more than just this battle. We risk losing the ideological war." The journey back to Terra was long, and Guilliman spent it in contemplation, reviewing everything Fulgrim had shown him, analyzing every argument his brother had made. He consulted with scholars, theologians, philosophers, anyone who might help him understand how to counter what the Emperor's children offered. The answer that emerged was uncomfortable in its complexity. Fulgrim wasn't entirely wrong. The Imperium did demand suffering. It did require its citizens to endure lives of grinding hardship, constant warfare, oppression in the name of survival. The justification had always been necessity, the argument that in a galaxy where everything wanted to kill humanity, there was no room for weakness, no tolerance for deviation, no possibility of anything beyond brutal pragmatism. But what if that justification was itself a form of corruption? What if the Imperium had become so focused on survival that it had forgotten what it was surviving for? These questions haunted Guilliman, and he found himself looking at the Imperium differently, seeing the cracks and failures with new clarity. Hive worlds where billions lived in conditions that differed from slavery only in terminology. Forge worlds where human workers were valued less than the machines they tended. Military campaigns where entire regiments were expended like ammunition because human life had become the Imperium's most renewable resource. When he returned to Terra, Guilliman did something unprecedented. He convened not a war council but a philosophical colloquium, bringing together representatives from every major faction in the Imperium. Not to plan Fulgrim's destruction, but to address the fundamental question his brother had posed. What was the Imperium offering its citizens that was worth fighting for? The discussions were heated, often veering into territory that previous generations would have considered heresy. Some argued for tradition, for maintaining the Emperor's vision regardless of cost. Others suggested reforms, gradual improvements to make Imperial life more bearable. But everyone understood that the real challenge wasn't military or political, it was existential. How do you convince someone that duty and suffering are meaningful when someone else is offering transcendence and joy? How do you argue that your path is better when you can't promise anything except more of the same grinding existence that has defined human life for 10,000 years? The answer, Guilliman realized, wasn't to compete with Fulgrim's offer. It was to create something different, something that honored the Emperor's original vision of a united, enlightened humanity, while acknowledging that enlightenment couldn't come through oppression and ignorance. Reforms began, slowly and carefully. Reforms that would take centuries to implement fully, but represented a fundamental shift in Imperial philosophy. Education initiatives on worlds that had never valued literacy. Cultural preservation programs that allowed populations to maintain local traditions instead of enforcing homogeneity. Even small measures to improve quality of life for the average Imperial citizen. Nothing revolutionary, but acknowledgments that humanity deserved to be more than just biomass for the war machine. These changes weren't about competing with chaos. They were about remembering what the Imperium was supposed to protect. Not just human bodies, but human dignity, human potential, the possibility that life could mean something beyond mere survival. Fulgrim's challenge had forced the Imperium to confront uncomfortable truths about itself, and while Guilliman could never accept his brother's solution, he had to acknowledge that the problem Fulgrim identified was real. The Imperium had become a monument to endurance, but monuments are for the dead, and humanity was still, somehow, miraculously alive. Viridia remained quarantined, a constant reminder of what the Imperium faced. But instead of simply containing it, Guilliman ordered extensive documentation of what had happened there. Let scholars study it. Let philosophers debate it. Let the Imperium understand exactly what its citizens were being protected from, or perhaps, what they were being denied. Some called this dangerous, argued that exposure to such information would spread the corruption. But Guilliman disagreed. Ignorance had never protected anyone. Understanding, even uncomfortable understanding, was the only real defense against seduction. If Imperial citizens knew what Fulgrim offered and chose the Imperium anyway, that choice would be more meaningful than blind obedience enforced through ignorance. And if some chose differently, well, perhaps that was information the Imperium needed to have. Perhaps knowing that its philosophy was being rejected would force continued evolution, continued improvement, continued striving towards something better than the grim darkness it had become. The Emperor's children continued their campaigns, but they too had changed, subtly. Fulgrim's invitation remained open, but the desperate flood of those seeking it had slowed to a trickle. Not because the Imperium had successfully suppressed knowledge of it, but because alternatives were beginning to emerge. Not alternatives as extreme as what FULGRIM offered, but possibilities that suggested life under the Imperium didn't have to be quite so brutal, quite so hopeless. It wasn't victory, not in any traditional sense. The war between FULGRIM's vision and Guilliman's duty would continue for as long as both brothers existed. But it had transformed from a military conflict into something more subtle, more important. It had become a competition of ideas, a struggle not for territory, but for the soul of humanity itself. And in that struggle, neither side could claim absolute righteousness. Neither philosophy offered perfect solutions. There was only the ongoing effort to find meaning in a meaningless universe, to create beauty in the face of horror, to maintain hope despite overwhelming evidence that hope was irrational. Guilliman sometimes wondered what his father would think of the choices he had made, the compromises he had accepted, the acknowledgement that FULGRIM's criticisms had validity even if his solutions were unacceptable. The Emperor remained silent, entombed in gold and psychic agony, unable to provide guidance or approval. Perhaps that was appropriate. Perhaps the time had come for humanity to chart its own course, to decide for itself what kind of civilization it wanted to be, without the crushing weight of a god-emperor's expectations. The Primarchs had been created as tools, but tools could be repurposed, could develop functions their creator never intended. And maybe, just maybe, that wasn't corruption but evolution. Maybe that was what it meant to be truly human, to take the gifts you were given and transform them into something new, something that honored the past while reaching toward an uncertain future. In the end, FULGRIM's return accomplished something neither he nor Guilliman could have predicted. It forced the Imperium to examine itself, to question whether survival was sufficient purpose, to ask whether the Emperor's dream had room for dreams beyond his own. It didn't resolve anything, didn't provide clean answers or comfortable certainties, but it created space for questions that had been suppressed for 10,000 years, questions about meaning and purpose, and what it means to be human in a universe that seems designed to extinguish humanity. The war continues, as it always has, as perhaps it always must. But now it's fought on multiple fronts, not just with bolters and battleships, but with ideas and philosophies and competing visions of what humanity could become. FULGRIM offers transcendence through sensation, Guilliman duty through improvement, and somewhere between those extremes, perhaps there's a path that honors both the need for structure and the desire for meaning. Perhaps the answer isn't choosing one brother's vision over the other, but acknowledging that the tension between them, uncomfortable as it is, represents something essential about the human condition. The Emperor's children will continue to corrupt, to seduce, to offer their dark gifts to those who feel abandoned by the Imperium's cold necessities. And the Imperium will continue to resist, to fight, to insist that there are prices too high to pay even for transcendence. Neither side will win completely, because the question they're fighting over doesn't have a final answer. What does it mean to be human? What are we willing to sacrifice for survival? And what must we preserve regardless of cost? How do we balance security with freedom, order with joy, the collective good with individual desire? These aren't questions that can be resolved with weapons or warfare. They're questions each generation must answer for itself, and the answers will always be incomplete, always be contested, always be evolving. FULGRIM returned to remind the Imperium of something it had forgotten in 10,000 years of grinding attrition, that the greatest battles aren't fought for territory or resources, but for the right to define what humanity means and what it could become. In that battle, there are no final victories, only the ongoing struggle to create meaning in the face of chaos, to find beauty despite horror, to insist that even in the grim darkness of the far future, there's more to existence than war. Whether that struggle is enough, whether it can sustain a civilization across the eons, remains to be seen. But perhaps asking the question is itself a kind of answer, a defiant assertion that humanity deserves to be more than what it has become, even if the path forward remains uncertain and treacherous and stained with the blood of those who dared to dream differently.